Betty wrote a letter to her in-laws, Dan and Yolanda Broderick, saying, Dan finally fessed up that he has been sleeping with his chief office girl for years. Number 1, he has now sued me for divorce. Number 2, put restraining orders on me to keep me away from my house. Number 3, had me found in contempt of court and subject to incarceration. What has happened to the man I married? He's gone absolutely mad. Is there anything you or Dad can do? Love, Bets. She never got a reply, and her own family wouldn't listen to her troubles either. They told her not to mention her marriage at her father's 70th birthday party in May in front of their friends. Just pretend everything is fine. November 1985. While Dan and Linda were in San Francisco following their Notre Dame trip, Betty was in Dan's house looking through the refrigerator. She could find no healthy, fun snacks for the kids, such as frozen yogurt bars or a box of Wheat Thins. She noticed a bottle of champagne. Dan liked to guzzle a cheap bottle of Gallo wine all weekend, so the champagne must be Linda's. She picked up the bottle and hurled it through a plate glass window. First cracks formed at the vortex where the bottle hit, then the whole panel fell down. Dan's reaction was to accompany her to get psychiatric counseling. Betty's version was different. She claimed Dan was accompanying her for marriage counseling. Once she got there, it became instantly apparent she was the only one to be treated. She believed it was another of Dan's sneaky legal ploys to set her up, to have her confide in a therapist that could later appear at their divorce court as a witness for Dan to indict his crazy wife.
At some point in time, did Dan talk to you about going to counseling?
Yes, there was one day we went to a Dr. Zedimer for counseling.
And now, what was the purpose of going to counseling, or what was your belief the purpose was?
I thought we were going to counseling, and I was absolutely very happy about it. It was a doctor he found, because earlier on I wanted him to go to counseling with me, and he wouldn't have gone to anyone that I found or anything. So this was a doctor he found, and we went together in one car to La Jolla, and I thought we were finally going to honestly discuss what's going on in our marriage here.
And do you know who was that person that you went to?
Dr. Matthew Zedimer.
Okay. And when you went to Dr. Zedimer, what happened? Did you two of you go into counseling?
We went in and met the doctor, but then Dan was going to leave me there and leave. Because he was, I was the one having the nervous breakdown. I was the one having trouble in life. And Dan wasn't going to be part of the discussion or the talk. It was my problem. And I said right in front of Dr. Zedimer that it's not just my problem. I mean, it's my problem with his affair or the affair I'm suspicious of with his office girl. So I can't really just discuss my problems with you without him here.
And did Dan indicate anything at that point, whether you were just crazy or not?
Well, he didn't need counseling, and he didn't want counseling. There was nothing wrong in his life. I was the one having the problems. So I'm the only one who needed help.
Dan now began sending her the first of many OSCs, order to show cause. This hauls Betty to court so she could explain why the Boston cream pie mess and the broken windows. Later, OSCs would be about a tossed toaster, a smashed stereo switch, a broken bedroom mirror, a broken answering machine with a hammer, broken sliding glass doors, spray painting wallpaper and the fireplace, a broken television set, a broken plexiglass cover on the stereo, and a broken front window. She threw a rock at his car, tore the antenna, tried to pull the car door open so far it would come off its hinges. As the vandalisms went on, Jaffe wrote Betty, "The wanton damage nonsense has to cease." If it did, he would be able to get the pending contempts dropped and proceed with her divorce case. Otherwise, he was going to dump her as a client. "I believe I understand the source of your rage at Mr. Broderick, but your anger simply has to be diverted through legitimate channels, one of which is to proceed with the divorce from him and get your rightful share of the assets and support to which you are entitled. He advised her to seek psychiatric assistance. 2 days later, on her birthday, Dan sent her roses along with a card. Dear Bets, I know the circumstances will make it impossible for you to have a happy birthday this year, but I wanted you to know that the kids and I are thinking of you and hope you start to feel better soon. Dan. Betty saw this as taunting her. 2 weeks later, she sent Dan a plaid shirt for his birthday. He sent it back.
Was there any conversation about you being ill or sick?
Ever since 1983, those were the conversations, is that I was delusional and I was paranoid and I was imagining things and I was having a nervous breakdown and my wheels were coming off and I was crazy and I was sick. Yes, when he had the children and I wasn't living with them, he'd always tell them, oh, your poor mother's sick. Your mother's sick.
And did you, now after you received the divorce papers, did you have contact, did Dan contact you at any time in writing? On your birthday, did he contact you?
Yes, I received flowers with a card that said, I'm sorry you're not feeling well under the circumstances. Love, Dan. I think that's what it said.
And did you know where he was at that time?
No, I didn't.
How did that card make you feel?
I was furious because it was just like the night that he finally told me the truth. It's not that I'm crazy or that I'm sick. You know, I'm angry about things, and I'm feeling fine under the circumstances. I'm just angry about what he had done.
Did he,
But I'm not sick.
December 1985. A huge bouquet of roses was sent from Dan, the biggest she ever received. The card said, I know you're not feeling well under these difficult circumstances, but Merry Christmas. According to Dan's daughter Lee, Dan and Linda referred to Betty as fat, disgusting, beastly, the beast, the monster, on the rampage, on the warpath. Her father refused to have anything to do with her mother. He didn't want to talk to her, he didn't want to see her, he didn't want to hear her voice. Dan's friends said he tried to work things out with Betty at first, but she would start cursing him and screaming whenever they met. If he tried to drive away, Betty would jump on the car and continue her verbal attacks. Dan decided there was no point to seeing her personally any longer. Any further contact would be through attorneys or court.
Did your mother often want to talk to your dad? Would she try to talk to him?
Yes.
And were there times when he would talk with her?
Yes.
And what?
Not very many. I mean, he didn't take all of her calls.
What would happen when he would ultimately take a call and talk with her?
It lasts about 3 minutes.
Why? What would happen?
Just start yelling. And then he'd say, I'm not going to listen to this.
Wait,
Bye.
who would start yelling?
Mom. And then
Thank you, Your Honor. Lack of personal knowledge. Sustained lay foundation for it.
Did you actually hear some of these conversations yourself?
yes, when I'd be at Mom's house or at Dad's house.
Okay.
Because when I'd be at Mom's house, Mom would want to talk to him, so I'd call Dad, and then Dad would get on the phone, and then the conversation would be over in 3 minutes.
So she would sometimes use you or ask you to call him so that she could talk to him?
Yes.
Okay, and you'd call your dad and you'd say, Dad, Mom wants to talk to you?
Right.
And then when he'd get on the phone, what would happen?
Then she would start yelling at him about whatever it was that she wanted to talk to him about. And then he said, I'm not going to listen to this, and then he'd hang up.
Okay.
Betty refused to accept that a restraining order couldn't allow her to approach her own children. Dan said, she kept saying, this is my house. I can come in whether you like it or not. I don't have to listen to the court order. The court can't keep me out of my own house. Dan had written Betty a note saying he was moving January 3rd, and she had until that time to tell him what pieces of furniture she wanted from Coral Reef ever since moving into Calle del Cielo. Betty could pick up her belongings from the garage while he was gone. Otherwise, he'd give them to the Salvation Army or throw them away when he returned. While Dan, Linda, and the kids were on their Christmas ski trip, Betty went to Coral Reef thinking she might take a few pieces of furniture for her empty house. She stared at Dan's Christmas tree and then down at the presents. One big box, typically from a department store, said, "To Linda." Her eyes went blind with rage as she ripped it apart. She tore other packages to shreds and finally threw something at a wall mirror. She left the house sobbing. Dan sent her yet another bouquet of roses from his ski trip. "Bets, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Love, Dan." She sat in her empty house for several hours before she fell asleep. Surveying the damage, Dan filed his third OSC. January 1986. Dan moved into his new house. Since he was now paying the mortgage on 3 houses, he wanted to sell Coral Reef as soon as possible. It had Betty's name on the deed along with Dan's, so he consulted her about the asking and selling price and which real estate agent to use. But Betty didn't want to sell the house. She said it was the only financial asset that had her name on it since Dan owned or controlled everything else they had. She was angry he spent $47,000 on decorating and landscaping the house to improve the chances of sale and wanted half that amount added to her half of the selling price of at least $325,000. A buyer came in for the minimum, but Betty refused to approve it. Jaffe came down from Los Angeles to represent Betty. He had negotiated that Dan would not only pay Betty's half of the selling price, but added an extra $18,000 she demanded to make repairs on her own new home. Jaffe's fee was also supposed to come out of the proceeds. When they set up a meeting at Dan's lawyer's office, Betty refused to be in the same room with Dan and waited in the car in the parking lot. Jaffe brought the agreement to her, but Betty rejected this one as well. Dan called her to ask her what it would take to sell the Coral Reef house. She wanted an extra $40,000 on the house to compensate for the bastard's damage to her house, her head, and her life. He promptly agreed. But yet another agreement was not signed. Jaffe warned her that the house could be sold without her approval if she persisted in blocking a legitimate offer. When Dan asked her how high the sale price would have to be to get her to sell, she said, $1 million wouldn't do it. It was at this point Dan's attorney went to court for an emergency order to sell. The sale went through without Betty's consent on February 4th, 1986. Although Jaffe was notified 4 hours before it was closed, Betty didn't find out about it until later. When she found out, Betty's parents were in town, and she was having them over for dinner. She excused herself, saying she would return shortly, but she had to talk to Dan about something. Her parents eventually left. She drove to the Cypress house, Dan's new home, but he wasn't there. When he arrived, he paled upon seeing her and ordered her off his property. Betty claims she wanted details of the sale. How was she going to get her half, or who he sold it to? Dan told her to call her attorney. By now it was clear Dan wasn't going to pay Jaffe his $10,000 retainer, as he recognized a heavy weight like himself when he saw one. He was afraid Jaffe would take him to the cleaners. Dan told Betty to pay him herself, so she went around town telling everyone that Dan wouldn't even pay her attorney fees. And she wasn't about to pay him herself because she didn't even want a divorce. After not getting responses to his calls to Dan's lawyer and not getting his retainer fee, Jaffe told Betty, "It is clear that you do not want a lawyer to represent you, and there is simply no way I can help you in this matter." And he quit the case. However, Jaffe did warn her that Dan was still moving on the divorce, and if she wasn't represented, the divorce would be accomplished by default, just like the house sale. It could be done with or without her participation. Frustrated, Betty drove to the Coral Reef house, smashed the glass door with a brick, sprinkled gasoline on the stairs, and tossed a lit match. The fire caused only minor damage, burning spots on the carpeting on the stairs. She returned to the Cypress house and drove up the circular driveway, extremely hysterical and crying. Then she rammed her Suburban into the front door, and then, in full view of Dan, she backed up the vehicle and rammed it again. Dan jerked open the driver's side door and grabbed for Betty. They gripped each other by the shoulders, Betty slamming Dan on the head with a heavy key ring. Dan punched Betty in the chest, and she fell. The police arrived and took Betty, handcuffed, in the back seat of the squad car to a mental hospital nearby. She was under observation for 3 days.
They were going to court about the sale of the Coral Reef house because no one lived there anymore. So they were going back and forth about that, and then they couldn't agree, and so
I just like you, if you could, to describe what happened when she came over to the house.
the first time she came over, she said, "I'm not leaving till I talk to him," and she wasn't supposed to be there. So I was asking her to leave, and she said, "He's going to be sorry. I'm not leaving until he gets here. I'm talking to him." So I called Dad. I'm like, "You better come home. Mom's here. She wants to talk to you." So he rushed home, and then she told me that she was going to burn down Coral Reef house, that she'd burn it before he'd sell it, and he can't do that. So then he came home, and they argued, and he said, "I'm not going to talk to you. You have to get out of here. You can't barge into my house and make demands, so you have to leave." And so eventually she left, and Dad called the police and said, "She's going to burn down the other house. Go over there and watch it." So I guess the police did that. And while we were talking about this in the kitchen, then the car came through the front door.
So before she had left, she had told you she was going to go burn down Coral Reef.
Right,
And that's why your dad knew about that.
right.
And then after she left, you were still there in the house with you and your dad, and was anybody else there?
Late,
And what were you doing when the car came through the front door?
making dinner.
And what was it that made you realize that the car was coming through the front door?
There's the sound, it sounded like a chainsaw. And then I just heard that, and then everything started shaking, and then I left. So I didn't know it was a car at the time. I didn't know until I came back up into the house.
When you say you left, where did you go?
Down the canyon.
Okay, your dad's house was on a canyon?
Yes,
And why did you go down in the canyon?
because I thought it was a chainsaw and that she was gonna chainsaw Dad. So I ran away.
You thought your mom was going to chainsaw your dad?
Yes, because I could hear Mom and I couldn't hear Dad. Dad wasn't saying anything. And so I assumed he was dead.
So you were afraid. Is that why you ran down into the canyon?
Yes.
And was there a point then when you came back up out of the canyon?
Yes,
And where was your mother at that point?
in the police car.
Okay. And did she do anything to you when she saw you?
She spit her tongue out at me.
I'm sorry?
She spit her tongue out at me.
She spit her tongue out, stuck her tongue?
Yeah.
Do you know why she did that?
No.
How did you feel at that time about your need for psychological help?
At the county mental health, you had an interview with a psychiatrist, and there was a form you had to fill out. What are your problems, and why are you crazy? And do you have drinking problems, drug problems, marital problems, all these kind of problems. And the only kind of problem I felt that I had at the time was I couldn't get a lawyer. I needed a lawyer. I needed a lawyer to represent me properly against Dan. And that's what I wrote on the form. My problem is I need a lawyer.
I would like to interject here. She had a lawyer, which was Jaffe. She would not take advice from the lawyer. She would not pay the lawyer. She had forgotten how hard it was to get this lawyer. which was nothing short of an act of divine intervention. And now he was gone. All that was left was this dramatic little speech.
I needed a lawyer. I needed a lawyer.
Jaffe had had enough of the Broderick case.
Why did you cease representation with them?
A number of reasons. She obviously wouldn't follow my advice, and I didn't think she would follow anybody's advice. Her conduct would just have us in court all the time, and I just think it's non-productive to run up thousands and thousands of dollars in legal fees defending contempts and those types of proceedings. I just don't think it's productive time, and that's not in my expertise. We handle large asset divorce cases. My expertise is in dividing large estates, and I just thought it would be a horrible waste of time for me to have to keep coming down to San Diego to deal with all of these peripheral matters which never got to the heart of the issue. And clearly, and I also wasn't getting paid. So with a combination of those three factors, I essentially said, I really don't need this.
When Betty claimed Coral Reef was the only asset in her name, she lied. She had her name on the Cielo deed, the house she currently lived in. When a married couple buys a house, both names are put on the deed. That's why her name was on Coral Reef, and that's why her name was on Cielo. The Cypress house was in Dan's name only because these two were going through a divorce.
No. You did try to drive the car through the door, did you not?
I did purposely, and, I did bang my car into his door. I didn't try to drive it through anything. I banged my car into his door the day that he sold the family home, the only home we've ever owned that had my name on it and his name on it. He sold it in court without notifying me in any way, shape, or form. And I went to his house and said, "How did you do that? You can't do that." And he told me I had 10 seconds to get off his property.
So then you got in the car.
And I looked at that house as the only asset. It was indeed the only asset that had my name on it. Nothing else did, ever.
At her trial, when Jaffe was asked by Public Defender Jack Early whether he knew of any other assets in Betty's name, Jaffe averted the question because as her then divorce lawyer, he would know that Cielo was in her name as well. But he doesn't want to make Betty out to be a liar, so he feigns ignorance.
Well, sir, in this case, were you aware that this was the only asset, family asset, that was in the name of both parties?
At my involvement in the case, as long as I was involved in the case, I did not have a complete picture of what the community estate was, nor did I ever develop a complete understanding because of
Did you ever?
Because of the way I was in the case.
And what exactly had Dan done to make you think he was going to sell Calle de Cielo?
I told you, I always thought he would. He sold Coral Reef that had 10 years worth of equity in it. This house had no equity. I thought it would be gone like that. I used to joke around and say, "Oh my God, I've been away from home for 4 hours. Maybe my house is gone."
And it never happened, did it, Mrs. Broderick?
No, he finally took his name off it when he was court ordered, but not voluntarily.
She couldn't tell Oprah and the world the real reason she wouldn't sell. It's just conjecture, but I believe it was to have Dan over a barrel. Besides the monthly mortgage, Dan had to pay taxes and insurance, maintenance costs, such as mowing the lawn, garbage pickup bills, and then deal with the possibility of squatters and vandals. With her name on the deed, she could vandalize it with impunity, and the restraining order would be lifted because he no longer lived there. It gave her the power to have him bend to her will. For her consent to sell, he would have to give her something in return, maybe coming back into the marriage, maybe getting a stupendous divorce settlement, maybe high spousal support. But when he sold it, the power she had over him went poof. The fire damage at Coral Reef was minimal, a broken door and some burned patches on the stairs. The Cypress house required immediate repairs. New locks were put on all the doors, and Dan hired a guard to watch the house for a few weeks. Later, the hospital report introduced to her murder trial would describe Betty as habitual maladaptive problems, exploitation, glib social style, shallow, indifferent to the feelings of others, histrionic, and immature demands for attention. Final diagnosis was that she was a borderline personality, histrionic, and narcissistic. Betty was now Crazy Betty all over La Jolla, and Dan even sent her the hospital bills. At Great Carey, where Dan used to work, there was a memo that detailed the steps to gain maximum leverage before filing for divorce. She had seen Patricia Monahan's attorney husband use the same tactics on her she recognized used by Dan. I'd say Dan went to the Dave Monahan divorce school. Get rid of assets, not pay taxes, not pay down credit cards, and all the similar things Monahan did during his divorce. Betty went about town saying Dan had sold her house out from under her, and the courts let him. If it could happen to her, then it could happen to them. Whenever Betty went on a rampage, there was an incident that preceded it. The pie incident, the soccer incident, the redecorating of Coral Reef. Dan and Betty would give different versions of what happened. Which one do you believe? I believe Dan is the liar, especially the brazen soccer incident where everyone just happens to be gone when Betty was supposed to pick up Rhett. The birthday and Christmas cards, the giving her clothes to the maid, the child's ring, the drunken call from Notre Dame reminiscing how much fun they used to have. Dan continued on his relentless campaign of baiting her volatile temper while she was in this very fragile state of heartbreak and life upheaval. Just a little more should send her flying off the edge to make her snap. It wasn't until she rammed his house in an incident in which he was not baiting her did he realize he created a monster, a Frankenstein that he lost all control over. This was the turning point. After this incident, there would be no more taunting from Dan. He was scared.
This is after she ran a car in the house. Then he was just scared.
February 1986. A week after she was released from the mental hospital, Dan sent the children back to their mother for a week-long ski trip to Keystone that was on him, no matter what the cost. Betty accepted the gift, but his gesture only further enraged her. Dan was to learn that attempting a truce was a horrible and tragic mistake, because rather than being equally conciliatory, Betty saw that as a sign of weakness from Dan. She had him on the ropes. He was caving. It emboldened her. Time to turn the screws for a divorce settlement while the house ramming incident was still fresh in his mind. It worked. Within a couple months' time, Dan came up with a settlement proposal. April 1986. Dan wrote Betty a letter outlining his proposal for the divorce settlement. Number 1, they would be awarded joint custody of the children with primary physical custody to him and reasonable visitation to her. He would provide no child support, but would continue to pay her $9,000 monthly spousal support until further order of the court. For property issues, she would get half of their property, or $334,000. He would assume their community debts, estimated at $345,000, but in exchange she would make no claim on his multi-million-dollar law practice. He added he thought she should be entitled to share, to some degree, in the fees he acquired while they were married, but he intended to subtract 40% for overhead, then prorate the rest to the time they were together. The 40% was an arbitrary figure based on his own calculations. He gave her an example. He urged her to let him know if this was suitable as soon as possible. Best regards, Dan. Here is the example he gave her. Assume that I received a fee of $600,000 and that 2/3 or $400,000 of that sum was community property. This $400,000 figure would first be reduced by the overhead percentage, 40%, leaving $240,000. Your 1/2 share would be $120,000, and from that $120,000, I would be entitled to deduct what had been paid to you up to that point in time as spousal support. What? How is it legal for him to deduct previous spousal support? Carrying on. In other words, if you received 6 months of spousal support that had not already been taken into account in earlier distributions, then this hypothetical $120,000 would be reduced by 6 times $9,025, or $54,150. In short, she would get about $65,000 from his $600,000 fee. Now about that spousal support deduction. Since Dan was volunteering the monthly $9,000 spousal support instead of it being court-ordered, he's claiming it as a cash advance he gave to Betty, which must be repaid. Therefore, her $9,000 spousal support that has mysteriously increased to $9,025 in his example is coming out of her half of the community property. So she's paying for her own spousal support. He does the same thing with the $140,000 down payment on the Cielo house. He claims it's cash he advanced to her. So the full amount comes out of her half of community property. He will do the same thing with the future $10,000 attorney retainer fees he pays for Betty. So in the murky finances of Dan, any money he pays out on her behalf later gets deducted from her side of community property as a cash advance, further eroding her settlement. There's another thing he doesn't explain. He claimed if he received a fee of $600,000, then 2/3 of that would be community property. Why? What happened to the other $200,000? Is it overhead? You know, to pay for the office rent, the salaries of people he employs to type documents, couriers, and so forth. But then from the remaining amount, which is $400,000, he deducts a 40% overhead fee. So he's deducting overhead twice? This is Betty's response to Dan's proposal. I don't know what the hell it meant, but I did know it sounded like I was getting royally screwed. Needless to say, the offer was rejected. Dan managed to whittle away Betty's side of community property in 3 ways. Number 1, he racked up Epstein credits. Number 2, he claimed cash advances on Betty's side of community property. Number 3, he squirreled away assets in Brother Larry's name so it would not be included in the divorce settlement. Epstein credits, or should I say debits, is a way of obscuring financial calculations and whittling down one side of community property, usually the wife's. One way of doing this is through real estate properties held by the couple. To evenly split the real estate in a divorce, the couple sells the property and divides up the proceeds. But if one person wants to hold on to the buildings, he would have to buy out the other person's share. So if a building is appraised at $400,000, he would have to add $200,000 to the community property of the other because he has bought out that person's share. But here is where Epstein credit convolution comes in. If the person claims the building devalued since it was bought, he can claim a loss, which the other side has to share. So if it devalued by $100,000, $50,000 loss is subtracted from the other person's side of community. Sadly, most of Dan's investments turned out to be losers. So there were a lot of Epstein credits flying. Another way to diminish the other side's community property is to claim cash advances. Essentially, any money Dan paid on her behalf is claimed as a cash advance. If he gives her money to take the children on a ski trip, that could be a cash advance. And yet there is a third tactic Dan employed to diminish her property settlement. He squirreled away assets in his brother's name, thereby not having these assets included in the divorce settlement. Essentially, he puts an asset he and his brother shared fully in Larry's name by redoing the deed. Since possession is 9/10 of the law, Dan has to safeguard that Larry doesn't abscond with the asset by refusing to put Dan's name on the deed when the coast is clear. So Dan has Larry sign a promissory note for half the cost of the asset. When it's safe to put Dan's name back on the deed, they redo the deed and Dan tears up the promissory note. Everything is done on paper. No money is ever exchanged. But there are records of this. Betty accidentally caught a couple transactions that occurred right before the date of separation, which is February 28th, 1985, when he walked out. This is one of the reasons Dan would later want the divorce documents sealed. Too much malfeasance going on for public scrutiny.
There is no hidden money or no hidden bank accounts. There are no hidden assets in any way, shape, or form. You can spend from now until doomsday looking. You won't find anything else. There is nothing else. I know respondent believes otherwise. She's mistaken. If there was anything else, I would have engaged in income tax fraud and probably a lot of other things. There is nothing else.
Except that we found at least those 2 bank accounts that he emptied, so he was obviously lying about those then.
Okay.
And
well,
whatever else there was that I wasn't lucky enough to uncover.
Really?
Those.
There was some questions that were asked about assets that you were suspicious of or worried about.
Yes.
Okay. Was there any property or that was bought just before separation that changed just after separation?
Yes.
And what was that?
It was a residence in Pennsylvania that Dan and Larry were buying together. And it was just, they were buying it together and then they undid the deal and then they did the deal again where it was Dan's money, but only Larry's name appeared on the property. But everybody knew it was half Larry's and half Dan's.
Now, before Dan left, whose property was it? Before February of 1985? I mean, who was buying it?
Dan and Larry were buying it together, 50-50.
Okay. And was there money that went before the split up that went to the purchase of the property?
Yes, the money that Dan used to buy 50% of that property was community property money.
Okay. And then after he left, did the title of the land or did the arrangement with Larry change?
Yes.
And how did that change?
Because the Dan's name did not appear on the property, but it was a gentleman's type agreement between Larry and Dan and the third party that Dan owned 50% with Larry, but the paperwork only showed that Larry owned it all.
And did that money then become a loan to Larry?
Yes, on paper.
Dan was funneling money to Larry. So Dan and Larry had a lot in common. Neither of them wanted to give their wives 1 red cent in a divorce.
Was there any suspicions about Dan funneling money to Larry Broderick?
Yes.
Okay, and why were you? What were those suspicions about?
Well, because I was party to a conversation in Larry Broderick's house a few years earlier, and Larry's friend was present, and he was getting a divorce, and Larry let known his feelings about women in divorce, and he said that.
Objection, Your Honor. Your Honor.
Stand. Well, did you believe that money was being funneled to Larry Broderick?
Yes, I heard Larry said he
Your
could
Honor,
do that.
excuse me.
You can answer that yes or no.
Yes.
We'll get to the reasons.
Yes.
What were the reasons?
I
Because
object,
of-
Your Honor.
State of mind, Your Honor. What were the reasons?
Because of this conversation that I heard of with Larry, that I was right there. I wasn't eavesdropping or anything. That he was advising this other man who was getting a divorce how to become broke on paper at the time of the divorce and then get the money back on paper. And that it was, Larry's feeling that his wife should not get one copper penny, he said.
Okay. And just before Dan walked out, had there been a number of dealings that you knew that Dan was sending money to Larry Broderick?
A lot of them. Larry had control of all of our investments, as far as I knew. Dan was so busy being a lawyer that he didn't have time for investing, and so he sent all of our money to Larry, and Larry was the investment arm of our family.
Before Dan had walked out, had there been anything that happened with receiving any paperwork from Larry?
Yes, in 1984, I got at the front door a big, thick manila envelope hand-delivered by someone. And I opened it up. I didn't know what it was. And it was real estate things or something about a deal in Colorado. So when Dan came home, I showed him that it came to the house, and he got very mad that it came to the house. He didn't want me to know about something that was going on. And I didn't think much of it at the time. But later on, I thought, no wonder he was mad about things.
Memorial Day, 1986. After Dan and Linda dropped the kids off at Betty's house, they went to the Price Club and bought an answering machine. It didn't take long for Betty to discover it.
This is a message to Ed and the You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate with me about my plans for the weekend.
A few minutes later came another.
Hey, come get the kids. I want to get rid of them, but I don't like driving to your neighborhood. Hurry up, come get them. Asshole.
It didn't dawn on him before, but Dan realized he could use these messages as proof he had been driven from his marriage by a crazy woman. Within days of Betty's last message, the perky voice of Linda Coquina was on the greeting. Hi, this is the Broderick residence. We're out and about. Leave a message and we'll call you back. Staggered by Linda's gall, Betty lunged to her tormentor with messages such as,
What's this? We can't come to the phone. You're not supposed to come to the phone at the house. You're supposed to at the house, answer the phone at the office.
She called the line again. Can't you stop f***ing long enough to come to the phone? She dialed again. Cunt, what are you doing on this phone? Don't you have a toilet to live in of your own? And again. You whore, you cunt. You've stolen my husband, you've stolen my children, you've stolen my house, you've stolen my life. Over the next 3 years, Betty made hundreds of calls to his house. The overwhelming majority of them were completely innocuous, nothing more than a mother's calls to her children. The only ones Dan saved were those from moderately ugly to disgusting. He would drop off the tapes to have them transcribed by his secretary. Stormy Weather, Dan's secretary, remembers Betty's voice. Just listening to her gave me the creeps. Her voice was so maniacal. It reminded me of The Exorcist. She sounded so evil, especially her laugh. It was a cackle. Linda would say, "Oh, great, here's another one we can use."
Okay. And would you ever see Linda get involved in the answering machine and making tapes?
Yes, she would. If there was a message with obscene language from my mom, she would take the tape out of the machine and copy it on a different tape from my dad.
Okay. Was there ever a time where you would watch Linda listen to your mother call and then turn the ringers off and wait to see if she called back and left bad messages?
There was a time when the ringers were already off and the volume was low and the red light was on and you could tell that somebody was talking. So she turned up the volume and it was my mom talking and she told me, "Don't pick up the phone."
Okay. Now, what would her attitude be like when she got the tapes?
She'd be happy if she could get a tape with bad language. She would be doing my father a favor.
The prosecutor played so many of the tapes that board reporters started referring to it as the best of Betty. Even Betty played along, saying, "Hit it, Pearl," every time the prosecutor headed for the tape player. In time, Dan would use Betty's phone messages to have her both jailed and fined. He took copies of her messages to the children's psychiatrist and his attorney, in which both agreed she was too unfit even to be granted visitation rights with her children. June 1986. As he had done before, Dan sent the children away to camp and then to visit his parents without consulting Betty. She became more aware of how dependent she had become on Dan Broderick's largesse. "Fuckhead, I want to get my car fixed. It's a mess, and the insurance policy is in your name, so you have to do it. Ha ha, bye." Then moments later she called back, "The car is also in your name, so you're stuck doing it. Bye, toodaloo." Then later, "Fuckhead, pick up this phone right now. I'm opening the mail and I see the insurance on this house has been canceled. I now have no insurance on a major investment." July 1986. Dan informed Betty of the penalties he was going to withdraw from her spousal support for violations she incurred on her troublemaking.
"I'm going to withhold $200 for every obscene word you use, $500 every time you come into my house, and $1,000 every time you take the kids away without telling me in advance."
The divorce date of July 16 was coming up, and Betty didn't have a lawyer. She tried to lure Jaffe back, but he wouldn't have anything to do with the case. She scoured the phone book, but so many lawyers turned her down, either because they didn't want to go up against Dan or because of her reputation as a crazy lady who wouldn't take legal advice. She called Gloria Allred, who did not return her call. Finally, July 16th rolled around, and Betty received a 4-hour notice for a divorce proceeding. She requested a postponement until she found legal representation, but the judge refused to grant it. She had no lawyer and figured if she didn't show, the judge would be forced to postpone it. She wasn't even in court on the day Dan Broderick was granted a divorce. The judge gave Dan everything he asked for. Number 1, legal and physical custody of the 4 children. Number 2, no visitation rights for the mother unless she got into therapy. Number 3, reiteration of existing restraining orders, preventing the mother from coming within 100 yards of the house. Number 4, the dissolution of the marriage shall be bifurcated, meaning the division of their property would commence at a later date. Dan was divorced and still held control of all the money and the children. Court-ordered support settlement and the division of their community property would be handled at a later date, so Betty relied on Dan's voluntary $9,000 monthly allowance. Betty was in shock. How could she be divorced when she hadn't even been in court, when she had no attorney to defend her, and now denied the right even to visit her children? Where was the proof she was an unfit mother? Betty was outraged. Dan Broderick had taken her children, her money, and now publicly shames her as an unfit mother. A week after their divorce, Dan sent a letter. "I am tired of coming home and finding messages full of obscenities on my answering machine. As I have pointed out to you in the past, every time you call me, you are violating a court order. From now on, when you leave a message or call and use any vulgar or obscene language, you will be fined $100 per offensive word. These fines will be withheld from your support checks. Believe me, I'm not doing this to bait you. I just want to deter you from using language in your dealings with me which any normal, civilized person would find extremely objectionable. She reacted with even more fury. She began stealing the children from his house, encouraging them to meet her on street corners. Dan would cancel the children's visits to her house if her behavior that week had displeased him. Betty believed Dan and Linda used her as a weekend babysitter and would abruptly cancel their visits, saying she had other plans. She left more vile messages on his machine. August 1986. Attorney J. William Hargreaves was designated to lead negotiations on their settlement, which got nowhere because Dan refused to pay a $5,000 fee and Betty didn't believe she should share in the cost because she never wanted a divorce anyway. But Hargreaves was beginning to sound more like Dan Broderick's personal advisor than a detached mediator. He wrote a letter, "Dear Dan," with no copy to Betty. He urged Dan to fork over the mediation money. After mediation collapsed, Hargreaves volunteered to be Betty's divorce attorney. She didn't really want him. He didn't have a top-notch reputation. But at this point, she was desperate. She paid his $800 retainer fee.
Were you told what was going to happen, how the court was going to decide support?
Yes, Mr. Hargreaves informed me that there were guidelines that the court had to follow that were based on percentages of income. And I had presented Mr. Hargreaves with my budget of how much I needed for everything. And he said, I don't need this. You're going to get a certain percentage. And his impression was, for me alone, I would get between 30 and 40% of Dan's income. And if I had the children, I would get as much as 60% with the 4 children. And Dan was making well over $100,000 a month. So Mr. Hargreaves said, I don't need your little budget here. You're going to get more money than you know what to do with. And so we went to court, and that's what he told me.
Yeah. Now, after you went to court, did you find out something that went on in court about relative lifestyles?
Yes.
And what did you find out?
Is that what Mr. Hargreaves led me to believe, what Mr. Hargreaves himself believed wasn't going to happen at all.
Within months, she fired him because she claimed he was nothing more than Dan's stooge. He sat idly by while Dan managed to get the entire divorce proceeding sealed from the public.
Now, at that time, what was the status of the court that you were in? Was it an open courtroom where they were conducting open business?
The one hearing I had where Mr. Hargreaves was in charge, he agreed against my wishes right in the courtroom to seal the court and the records and the proceedings. That was my first time in court, and they were sealed from my first time there.
Okay. And when you say sealed, what did that mean?
That meant that when we were having a proceeding about my divorce, there was no one allowed to be watching.
Okay, so it didn't...
No one except the principals and their attorneys were allowed in the courtroom. And they even taped up the windows so people couldn't look in.
And how about the court file? Were people able to go to the court file and see what was going on in your case?
No, the court file was also sealed, which meant that nobody but the principals in the case could have access.
Hargreaves also goofed up the spousal support because he forgot to include taxes and insurance in his figures, which she had to pay another attorney to correct. Hargreaves sued Betty for several $1,000s in unpaid legal fees, despite the fact that Dan had paid him his $10,000 retainer fee behind Betty's back. So Dan wants Hargreaves as Betty's divorce attorney because he can control him. To induce Betty to hire Hargreaves, Hargreaves tells her his retainer is $800 instead of the usual $10,000. What a deal! Dan may have also coached Hargreaves to tell Betty that she can get as much as 60% of his income if she had custody of the kids. Dan knows what motivates his wife. Fait accompli. Hargreaves was now her divorce attorney. Dan pays Hargreaves his $10,000 retainer without Betty's knowledge. Hargreaves' first order of business is to not protest too hard when Dan pushes to seal the divorce proceeding against Betty's wishes. And then Hargreaves makes a mistake in the spousal support calculation. In Dan's favor, by not accounting for taxes and insurance.
When you went into court with Mr. Hargreaves and you finally got the court-ordered support, was there a problem with that court-ordered support? Did it end up being less than you were getting before?
Yes.
Okay. And did you have to go back to court to straighten that out?
Yes.
Okay. And some point later on, were there other problems with Mr. Hargreaves during the time he was representing you?
There were constant problems with Mr. Hargreaves, yes.
And eventually, did you dismiss Mr. Hargreaves?
Not until I got another attorney, but yes.
Okay. And did you find out sometime during that Mr. Hargreaves had communicated with Mr. Broderick before you retained him that would put you at a disadvantage?
Yes.
Okay. How did you feel about that?
Well, I knew he wasn't doing a good job representing me. He hadn't even done any discovery at all before we went into court that time. It was just pathetic. And I didn't know why until later, and then I found out later that he had made an agreement behind my back with Dan Broderick that if Dan indeed sent him money, that he'd give Dan a good deal.
Okay. And did you see at some point in time a handwritten letter from Mr. Hargreaves to Dan that was written before you were retained, before he was retained?
Yes.
Okay.
Going further, the original judge, Judge Jones, will be replaced by one Judge Anthony Joseph, who is honored to meet Dan.
At the time that you went in 1987, were you ever assigned a judge different than Judge Jones?
Yes. Then we went to, for some reason, we ended up going to Judge Anthony Joseph, Tony Joseph.
Okay. And when you went to Tony Joseph, was he in the family law court?
It was in this building, but it was for contempt actions. So no, I don't think so.
Well, you went to, the next judge you saw was Tony Joseph.
Tony Joseph.
And
In this building.
What happened when you went into the courtroom the first time that you went to that court?
Well, it was a longer center aisle, and as we walked down the center aisle, it was Tricia Smith and myself and Dan Broderick, and his attorney was behind us, and the judge looked up and saw Dan and said, Mr. Broderick, to what do we owe the honor?
And what was the response?
Well, Dan said hi. They were obviously friends, and my attorney said, excuse me, Your Honor, we're here for a proceeding.
And at that point in time, did you object to that judge hearing your proceedings?
Well, he explained on the record what a long-time, good personal friend he was of my husband's, how they had worked on committees and boards of directors, etc., for many years, and he held my husband in very high regard and esteem. Those are as close as I can get his exact words. And he said, is that a problem for you, Mrs. Broderick? And my attorney told me to say yes. And I said, do I have a choice? And he said no.
Okay. And from that point on, for the next year, did Judge Joseph end up being the judge that heard all the actions in this case?
From that very first day, he retained jurisdiction, which meant that, yes, he would hear all the actions in that case.
So now we have Hargreaves and Judge Joseph in Dan's corner and probably in his pocket, as well as the head judge of family court, who was Dan's previous divorce attorney, Thomas Ashworth. And then there's Gerald Berry, who will be Dan's divorce attorney. As usual, Dan declared Hargreaves' $10,000 retainer as a cash advance from Betty's half of the community property.
How was he paid the $10,000?
Dan sent it to him, I guess.
Objection.
Do you know how that $10,000, was that a gift from Mr. Broderick, was going to be credited to you? Do you know? Have you ever heard the term advance on the community? Have you ever heard that term?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's arguing.
Stand. Have you, I'll ask it nicely, have you ever heard of the term advance on community?
Yes, when Mr. Jaffe was doing the 10,000 retainer business, that term came up, that it would not be in advance, termed in advance on community, that the court would decide later with Mr. Jaffe's 10,000. But then there was letters back and forth between Ashworth and Jaffe and lies and everything, and then all of a sudden Hargreaves gets $10,000 advance on my community that I didn't know about.
He also got a $10,000.
And here is Betty holding her own when prosecutor Carrie Wells tries to ridicule the suggestion of any collusion going on.
Go ahead.
Did Judge Joseph ever tell you that it was not his belief that this was a personal vendetta by Mr. Broderick?
I don't remember him telling me that, but if you're in 1988, this is after I threatened him in writing to complain to the Judicial Council.
Excuse me, Mrs. Broderick, if you could just answer the question. You indicated you don't remember him ever saying that, is that correct?
Right, but I understand why he would be at this stage, why he's making a record.
If you could look at the transcript of May 4th, 1988, page 60, this paragraph here, and read it to yourself to see if that refreshes your recollection.
Yeah.
And isn't it true that Judge Joseph told you that he did not believe these proceedings were being filed out of spite or anything akin to spite? The court did not share that view.
I think he's covering his ass and he's lying because by this point it was very obvious to the court, to myself, and to everyone else alive that that's exactly what Dan Broderick was doing. And there was no other reason for his ridiculous contempts in 1988.
And your testimony is that Judge Joseph was part of this vendetta and he was lying to you at each of these hearings and he was part of this whole conspiracy against you.
He wasn't lying to me, he was covering his bottom there. Because
well, is that lying or not?
He's making a record in his own defense because I had already complained in writing that that's exactly what Dan Broderick was using the public courts and the taxpayers' money for.
Was this because Judge Joseph had some personal vendetta against you?
No, but he was a friend of Dan's because that's what he told me he was.
And so you're saying that that Dan Broderick
was misusing the public court.
Him? Dan Broderick?
No, didn't need to.
Just used his influence on Judge Joseph, and Judge Joseph is a crooked judge.
Your Honor, I'll
no.
check this argument.
Well, you're saying he's lying, he's covering his
I think there's a lot of influence peddling going on that doesn't involve signatures or records or money at all.